The Profile of a Troubled Young Girl. This is chapter 1 of The Diabolic Mind. Percy swirled the beer in his hand, elbows rested, body slumped, over the bar top, eyes heavy with the drink, mind idle, as far away from work as he could get it. His ashy black hands rubbed thoughtlessly over his shirt sleeve. As though agitated, he loosened up his tie and threw open a button on his vest. Then roughly patted his graying, pillowy hair. Sam's was always where he'd come to get away from work when he was in a mood like this. Something he liked to call professional alcoholism. Though just joking about that soured his frame of mind even more. He wasn't a day drinker, never found himself sneaking sips on the job, never drank alone, and yet found himself at that bar of Sam's cramped restaurant on a daily basis. It was a nice establishment, though. While small, it was friendly and bright with fake vines and flowers. Like the inside of a good friend's house, and not at all dark and woody like an actual bar. However, he knew the excuses all too well. It's just a couple drinks. I never get drunk. It's only to help with the stress. I'm just ordering a couple with my meal like any adult. And yet, he'd find himself there, daily, right after work, slumped over the bar, poking through whatever meal he'd ordered with his drink, hardly even eating. To be fair, the job was hard on the mind, and alternatives were sedative medication. Percy was the only psychiatrist who would work with children so young and unstable. The job would come with an automatic level of heartbreak that only a monster would be numb to. Much as he could stiffen up his act at work, afterwards, it all came crashing down on top of him, and a couple of beers was better than despair. Most of his patients were wards of the state, some in foster care, a few that had escaped with a guardian they could trust. The good doctor knew all too well what monsters were capable of. Children, some as young as 4, had their minds destroyed by adults. Those adults were once children whose minds had been destroyed by adults, and they were perpetuating a cycle normalized by their internalized torment. The thought of it bubbled in his stomach with an anger that was difficult to repress. The idea that a person who knew that torment would choose to inflict it on another child just as it had been inflicted on them, especially when it was their own child, not at him. There was little room to show monsters such empathy. There was the occasional anomaly, perhaps brain damage or some form of inherent irregularity, like presenting schizotypal or severe spectrum disorder, but a child that was just off. It was admittedly hard to feel as sorry for them as the children who were victimized. In a way, they were easier to manage than children who'd come from violent or sexual abuse. Perhaps that was how 9-year-old Parisia elders had slipped through the cracks. Percy considered that he might have phoned it in, even subconsciously. The case just didn't seem as dire at the time. If the patient didn't present so strangely, it wouldn't have even crossed his desk. On the surface, there was nothing more than odd disciplinary issues. The patient acted out, occasionally on the side of anger or agitation, but nothing out of the ordinary for his line of work. He'd been used to children who committed serious acts of self-harm, or would even lash out violently at adults and other children. Parisia's emotional responses were muted and unusual to the given circumstances. She obsessively focused on tasks that perhaps hinted at a disorder on the spectrum, but responded to any interference with these obsessions as though she presented with a personality disorder. She showed high developmental levels of intelligence and could be managed slightly with reason. But if reason didn't fit dynamically into her obsession, she would grow defiant and agitated. In a way, it almost mirrored obsessive personality disorder, considering how her obsessive behaviors could be interrupted. But the ritual she obsessed over was never consistent and changed weekly. It was all intensely difficult for her parents to work with, and Percy sympathized. But the child's behavioral problems didn't seem to be dire. That was before they found the animal remains. That was before Parisia tried to strangle her best friend Jessica to death in her playroom. The most perplexing part of this was that none of these more extreme behaviors were ever remotely hinted at in her case files. Usually, children drawn to violence, especially those as obsessive as Parisia, would manifest their violent desires in other ways: dismembering toys, erratic or angry drawings of family, strange and unusual aggressive forms of affection, self-harm. None of it was present in her case file. Some children simply seemed to naturally understand what they were doing could get them in trouble. However, Percy had never met a child that wouldn't slip up or didn't present in some way. The circumstances also suggested Parisia was clever enough to hide the most recent animal mutilations. The corpses discovered by the elders were so fresh, the smell putrid and pungent, blood lazily smeared on walls and the floor, intricate patterns, like child's art. She hadn't even really attempted to hide it well. The bloody finger smears were placed all over the house, the garage, the shed outside, and trees around the property. Though she didn't try to hide them, there were so many so poorly hidden, their discovery was inevitable. The blood had to come from somewhere, and that's when Mr. and Mrs. Elders found the bodies. Behind the shed, in the back corner of their modest lot, there was a pile of leaves covering a plot of freshly loose dirt. This compelled the elders to dig, not even deep into the soil, and they turned up dead thing after dead thing. Neither parent was able to stomach the smell of carrion from the rotting corpses already lingering in the air, but the plot became overpowering as they overturned the dirt moistened by decaying entrails and flesh. Significantly, it was more than just wild animals, but domesticated animals as well. Birds, cats, a dog, Jessica's missing hamster Benny. Most importantly to this detail was the fact that Parisia had never been Parisia had been initially friendly and playful with most of these pets. There were suggested emotional bonds with each animal that was suddenly broken and cast aside almost flippantly. Percy was almost certain this was a trauma response, so much so that he probed into both the parents and even closest friends of the family. It tragically wasn't uncommon for a child struggling with Parisia's issue to be taken advantage of by an adult in her family. Children like her were often targeted by predators. It had been weeks of digging and nothing led to that conclusion. A trauma event had to be written off for the most part. Now, the child who had slipped through the cracks was occupying the good doctor's central focus. Then the assault came yesterday. That's why it was described by the way it was described by Parisia. It was just a game. She and Jessica were just playing. She wanted to show Jessica something. Even as she described wrapping her hands around her friend's neck, it sounded like a harmless fancy. Parisia in detail described nearly strangling the life out of Jessica in her playroom. Watching her face change color, her eyes start to bulge and roll back in her head. Had an adult not found them and stopped her, Jessica would be dead. Yet, she insisted that this was not an issue. The young child went into a tear about how death was impermanent, and that there was nothing for Jessica to be afraid of. It almost came off like a programmed response, the sort of thing you'd hear from a brainwashed cultist. The idea came from somewhere, but where? Parisia's parents weren't religious. Hell, they were atheists. She wasn't being educated in a religious institution. She didn't have any peers in her direct social circle that followed religion particularly closely. Percy blamed himself, considering he'd missed something obvious. He'd become wrapped up in the idea that he hadn't been taking Parisia's case as seriously as others. Now it weighed on his conscience. A small child under his care almost committed murder and would have committed murder, and he was no closer to understanding why. A tall, slender individual with a feminine